The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as King Alexander paced nervously in his private study. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the letter that had arrived just hours before dawn. The royal seal was broken, but the words inside burned in his memory like a brand against his soul. For 35 years, King Alexander had ruled the prosperous kingdom of Valdoria with what many considered a steady hand. His marriage to Queen Victoria 28 years ago had been celebrated as a love match that brought stability to the realm. She had been a duchess from a neighboring kingdom, beautiful and intelligent, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk and eyes the color of summer storms. But the letter in his hands told a different story. A story that threatened to destroy everything he had built, everything he believed about his marriage, and everything his people trusted about their royal family. Queen Victoria sat in her morning room 3 floors below, completely unaware that her world was about to crumble. She sipped her tea from fine china painted with roses, reviewing the day's schedule with her lady-in-waiting Margaret. The Queen had always been meticulous about her duties, attending charity events, hosting diplomatic dinners, and maintaining the grace expected of Valdoria's First Lady. "Your Majesty, the ambassador from Westmarch arrives at 2 o'clock, Margaret said, consulting her leather-bound appointment book. "And the children's hospital visit is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Victoria nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. She had noticed Alexander's strange behavior over the past few weeks. He had been distant, spending long hours locked away in meetings with his closest advisors. When she asked about palace business, he gave vague answers and changed the subject quickly. The palace staff had begun to whisper. Servants who had worked in the castle for decades exchanged worried glances when they thought no one was watching. Something was wrong in the heart of Valdoria, and everyone could feel it. In the east wing of the palace, Prince Edward, the couple's eldest son and heir to the throne, reviewed military reports in his office. At 32, Edward had his father's strong jaw and his mother's quick intelligence. He had served in the Royal Navy and earned respect both within the palace walls and among the people of Valdoria. Princess Catherine, 28 years old and married to a duke from the southern provinces, was visiting the palace with her 2 young children. She had always been closest to her mother, sharing Victoria's love of literature and music. Catherine had inherited her mother's beauty, but also her father's stubborn streak. Neither of the royal children knew that their father had spent the previous night making the most difficult decision of his reign. The letter that arrived at dawn had forced his hand. It contained information that could destroy the monarchy itself if it became public knowledge. The information had come from Lord Harrison, the kingdom's spy master, and one of Alexander's oldest friends. Harrison had served the crown faithfully for 40 years, and his network of informants stretched across all the neighboring kingdoms. When Harrison requested an urgent private meeting, Alexander knew it must be serious. "Your Majesty," Harrison had said the night before, his usually steady voice shaking slightly, "I'm afraid I bring news that will cause you great pain, but you must know the truth before others use it against the crown." The truth, as Harrison revealed it, was devastating. Queen Victoria had been conducting a secret correspondence with Duke Magnus of Northland, a man she had known before her marriage to Alexander. But this was not simply an old friendship renewed. The letters Harrison's agents had intercepted contained evidence of something far more damaging. According to the intelligence Harrison had gathered, Victoria had been passing information about Valdoria's military defenses and trade agreements to Magnus, who was known to be ambitious and had his own claims to territories that bordered Valdoria. Whether Victoria understood the full implications of what she was doing remained unclear, but the evidence was undeniable. "She may believe she is simply maintaining a friendship," Harrison had said carefully, "but Magnus has been using the information she provides to position himself advantageously in negotiations with our neighbors. Some of our recent diplomatic setbacks now make perfect sense." Alexander had refused to believe it at first. Victoria, his beloved wife, the mother of his children, the woman who had stood beside him through every crisis of his reign. It seemed impossible, but Harrison had brought copies of the letters, written in Victoria's unmistakable handwriting. The letters themselves were not openly treasonous. They were written in the language of old friends sharing news and memories. But buried within the casual conversation were details about troop movements, trade negotiations, and political discussions from private council meetings. Information that only someone with intimate access to the king would possess. Now, as dawn broke over Valdoria Palace, Alexander faced a choice that no king should ever have to make. He could confront Victoria privately and hope to resolve the matter quietly. He could ignore the evidence and pray that no lasting damage would be done. Or he could take decisive action to protect his kingdom, even if it meant destroying his marriage and shocking his family. The palace bells chimed 7 o'clock, their deep bronze voices echoing across the capital city of Valdoria. Citizens were beginning their daily routines, merchants opening their shops, children walking to school, farmers bringing goods to market. None of them knew that their king stood alone in his study, holding evidence that would change everything. Alexander walked to his window and looked out over the kingdom he had sworn to protect. The responsibility of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Whatever decision he made would echo through history, affecting not only his own family but the lives of millions of people who trusted him to put their welfare above his personal happiness. The letter crackled in his hands as he made his choice. King Alexander sent word through his private secretary that evening, requesting an urgent family meeting in the blue drawing room. The message was delivered with unusual formality, causing immediate concern among the royal family members. Such meetings were rare and typically reserved for matters of the highest importance. Queen Victoria received the message while dressing for dinner. Her hand stilled on her pearl necklace as she read the brief note twice. The tone was formal, almost cold, addressing her as Your Majesty, rather than the affectionate "my dear" that Alexander typically used in their private correspondence. "Margaret," she called to her lady-in-waiting, "what do you know of the king's activities today? Has something happened that I should be aware of?" Margaret shook her head, but her expression was troubled. "Your Majesty, the king met with Lord Harrison for several hours this afternoon. The meeting was private, with no other advisors present. That's all I know." A chill ran down Victoria's spine. Lord Harrison only requested private audiences when dealing with matters of security or intelligence. She tried to recall if she had done anything recently that might have attracted the spymaster's attention, but her mind felt strangely blank. Prince Edward arrived at the palace within an hour of receiving his father's summons. He had been dining with fellow officers at the Naval Club when a royal messenger interrupted the evening with word that his immediate presence was required. The serious tone of the message had sent him racing through the streets of the capital in his carriage. Princess Catherine was already at the palace, but she too had received the formal summons. She dismissed her children's governess early and tucked her young son and daughter into bed herself, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would require her full attention. The blue drawing room had been prepared with unusual care. Heavy curtains were drawn against the night, and a fire crackled in the marble fireplace despite the warm evening. 4 chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing a 5th chair, where King Alexander would sit. The formal arrangement felt more like a court proceeding than a family gathering. Lord Harrison stood near the window, his presence immediately noticed by each family member as they entered. His weathered face was grave, and he carried a leather portfolio that seemed unusually thick. Whatever information he had brought clearly required substantial documentation. Victoria entered the room last, having taken extra time to compose herself. She wore a deep blue gown that complemented the room's decor, and her golden hair was arranged in an elegant style. Despite her careful preparation, she could not hide the worry in her storm-gray eyes. King Alexander waited until everyone was seated before beginning. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind, his back in a posture his children recognized from their childhood, when serious discussions were required. "I have called you here tonight because information has come to light that affects not only our family, but the security of our kingdom," Alexander began, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "What I'm about to share will be difficult for all of us, but the truth cannot be avoided or delayed." Victoria felt her heart begin to race. She gripped the arms of her chair slightly, trying to maintain the composed expression expected of a queen, even as fear crept through her chest. Edward and Catherine exchanged worried glances. Neither had ever seen their father look so stern, so remote. This was not the loving patriarch they knew, but the king in the full authority of his position. "Lord Harrison," Alexander continued, Please share with my family what you have discovered. Harrison stepped forward, opening his portfolio with deliberate precision. Your Majesties, Your Highnesses, I regret that my duty requires me to present evidence of activities that may constitute a breach of trust, with serious implications for our national security. The formal language sent ice through Victoria's veins. She watched as Harrison removed several documents from his portfolio, arranging them carefully on the table beside him. Over the past 6 months, our intelligence network has intercepted correspondence between Queen Victoria and Duke Magnus of Northland. This correspondence contains detailed information about military positions, trade negotiations, and private council discussions. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Edward's face went pale while Catherine gasped audibly. Victoria felt the room spinning around her as the full implication of Harrison's words became clear. That's impossible, Edward said firmly, rising from his chair. Mother would never compromise our kingdom's security. There must be some mistake. Alexander raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. Lord Harrison, please continue. Harrison's voice remained steady and professional as he detailed the evidence. He described how the letters had been intercepted, how intelligence analysts had identified sensitive information within seemingly innocent correspondence, and how Duke Magnus had used this information in recent negotiations with neighboring kingdoms. With each revelation, Victoria felt her world collapsing. The friendly letters she had exchanged with Magnus, sharing news and memories of their youth, had been twisted into something sinister. She remembered mentioning various details about court life, never imagining that such casual conversation could be interpreted as espionage. Magnus asked about these matters, Victoria said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. He would ask how you were managing certain situations, Alexander. I thought he was simply being polite, showing interest in old friends. I never thought. Her voice trailed off as she realized how naive she must sound. A queen should understand the implications of sharing any information about state matters, regardless of how innocent the conversation might seem. Catherine reached toward her mother instinctively, but Alexander's sharp look stopped her. The king was not ready for comfort or forgiveness to soften this moment. The damage has been significant, Harrison continued. Our negotiations with the Eastern Trade Alliance failed last month, partly because Duke Magnus was able to anticipate our positions. Our military reorganization in the border provinces has been compromised. Most seriously, there are indications that Magnus is building alliances with kingdoms that view Valdoria as a competitor. Alexander finally sat down, his movement slow and deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Victoria, he said, using her name without title for the first time in the presence of others. Your actions, whether intentional or not, have placed our kingdom at risk. They have compromised my ability to govern effectively and protect our people. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at her husband, seeing not the man who had loved her for nearly 3 decades, but the king who had sworn an oath to protect his realm above all else. Therefore, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger, I am removing your title as Queen of Valdoria. You will retain your courtesy titles and appropriate living arrangements, but you will no longer represent this crown in any official capacity. The shock was absolute. Edward jumped to his feet, his chair falling backward with a crash. Catherine burst into tears. Victoria sat frozen, unable to comprehend that her entire life had just been stripped away with a few formal sentences. Father, you cannot be serious, Edward said, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Mother made a mistake, perhaps, but to remove her title? The scandal alone will damage the monarchy more than anything she might have done. Alexander's expression remained implacable. The decision has been made. It will be announced quietly without public ceremony. Victoria will be known as the Duchess of Rosemount, a title that comes with appropriate income and residence, but no official duties. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Alexander, please, let me explain. Let me make this right. For just a moment the king's stern mask slipped and she saw the pain in his eyes, but then his expression hardened again. The decision is final. The silence that followed King Alexander's announcement stretched for what felt like hours, though only moments passed. The blue drawing room, which had witnessed countless family celebrations and intimate conversations over the decades, now felt like a tomb. The weight of the king's words hung in the air like a physical presence, changing everything forever. Victoria remained perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced composure that had been drilled into her since childhood. But beneath the surface, her mind raced frantically. 28 years of marriage, of shared responsibilities, of building a life together, had been swept away in a matter of minutes. The title that had defined her entire adult identity was gone. Prince Edward was the first to recover from the shock. His military training kicked in and he straightened to his full height, every inch the future king. But his voice betrayed the emotion he was trying to control. "Father, I request a private audience to discuss this decision. There must be alternative solutions that don't require such drastic action." His formal language was deliberate, a signal that he was speaking not just as a son, but as the heir to the throne who understood the political implications. Princess Catherine had stopped crying, but her face remained pale. She looked between her parents with the expression of someone watching a terrible accident unfold in slow motion. "How can we explain this to the children? To the people? Mother has been queen for nearly 3 decades. She's loved by the citizens." Alexander's jaw tightened. "The official explanation will be that the queen wishes to step back from public duties for health reasons. A gradual transition that allows for dignity, while protecting the information that cannot become public." "Health reasons?" Victoria spoke for the first time since the sentence had been pronounced, her voice sharp with sudden anger. "You would have me live a lie for the rest of my life? Pretend to be ill while you parade around with your righteous decision intact?" The flash of fire in her eyes reminded everyone in the room why Alexander had fallen in love with her decades ago. Victoria had never been a passive decoration on the throne. She had opinions, intelligence, and a strength that had served the kingdom well in countless situations. Lord Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest, the transition period allows for careful management of both public perception and security concerns. The goal is to protect the monarchy while minimizing damage to all parties involved." "Minimize damage?" Edward's voice rose dangerously. "You're talking about destroying our family to protect against a threat that may not even exist." Mother exchanged letters with an old friend. Perhaps she was indiscreet, but that hardly makes her a traitor. Alexander turned to face his son directly. "You weren't in the council meetings that failed because our positions were anticipated. You didn't see the intelligence report showing how our diplomatic strategies were being countered before we could implement them. Your mother's indiscretions have cost this kingdom dearly." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound was jarring in the tense atmosphere. "I will not sit here and be spoken about as if I'm not present. Alexander, you want to punish me for failing to realize that friendship could be construed as betrayal? Very well, but don't pretend this is purely about protecting the kingdom." Her words hung in the air with dangerous implication. Alexander's face darkened, but Victoria continued before he could respond. "You've been looking for a reason to distance yourself from this marriage for years. Oh, you've been correct and proper, never giving the gossips anything to whisper about. But I've felt the coldness growing between us. This situation simply provides you with a justification that makes you look noble instead of cruel." The accusation was devastating because it contained just enough truth to sting. Their marriage, like many royal unions, had evolved from passionate love through companionate partnership to something closer to a political alliance over the years. But Alexander's decision had been based on duty, not personal grievance. "That is unfair and untrue," Alexander replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying hurt. "Everything I do is for the protection of this kingdom and its people. Personal feelings have no place in such decisions." Catherine looked between her parents with growing horror. "So you're both going to tear apart everything we've built as a family because of pride? Father, your duty to the kingdom doesn't require you to humiliate the woman who has stood beside you for nearly 3 decades. And Mother, accusing Father of ulterior motives helps no one." Edward moved to stand beside his sister, presenting a united front. "There has to be another way. House arrest, if you're truly concerned about security. A temporary removal from public duties while the situation is investigated further. But permanent removal of Mother's title creates more problems than it solves." Lord Harrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could escape the family drama unfolding before him. His role had been to present the intelligence and advise on security implications, not to mediate a marital crisis that was now entangled with affairs of state. Victoria walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain to look out at the palace gardens bathed in moonlight. The rose garden where she had spent countless peaceful hours was barely visible in the darkness, but she knew every path, every bench, every carefully tended flower bed. Soon it would no longer be hers to enjoy. "I want to write to Magnus myself," she said suddenly, turning back to face the room. "Let me explain that our correspondence must end, that I cannot maintain personal friendships that compromise my position. Give me the chance to close this chapter with dignity before you strip away everything I've worked to build." Alexander considered this for a long moment. Any communication with Duke Magnus would be reviewed by Lord Harrison before being sent. "And it would not change my decision about your title." "I understand," Victoria replied quietly. "I'm not asking you to reverse your decision, Alexander. I'm asking for the opportunity to take responsibility for my actions, rather than being treated like a prisoner in my own home." The king's expression softened almost imperceptibly. This was more like the woman he had married, someone who faced consequences with dignity rather than denial. "Very well. You may write to Duke Magnus, but the letter will be reviewed and may be edited if necessary for security reasons." Edward was shaking his head in frustration. "This is madness. You're both acting as if this decision is irreversible, as if there's no way to step back from this precipice. Think about what you're doing to the monarchy itself. When word gets out, and it will get out, the scandal will damage the crown far more than anything Mother might have done inadvertently." "The decision stands," Alexander repeated firmly. "Lord Harrison will work with the palace communications staff to develop an appropriate narrative for public consumption. The transition will be gradual and dignified, but it will be complete." Victoria returned to her chair with the slow, careful movements of someone who had aged a decade in a single evening. "When will the announcement be made internally?" "The palace staff will need to be informed before they hear rumors from outside sources." "Within the week," Alexander replied. "Department heads first, then senior staff. Lower-level employees will be informed as the transition becomes visible in your reduced public schedule." Catherine wiped away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. "What about official portraits? The Queen's suite? Her lady-in-waiting staff? There are 1,000 practical details that need to be addressed." Lord Harrison finally spoke up again. "These matters will be handled gradually and discreetly. The goal is to avoid any sudden changes that might prompt questions or speculation." As the family began to grapple with the overwhelming practical implications of Alexander's decision, the emotional devastation was slowly being buried under layers of royal protocol and damage control. But beneath the surface, relationships had been permanently altered, and trust had been shattered in ways that might never fully heal. The meeting was clearly winding down, but no one seemed quite sure how to end it. How do you conclude a conversation that has just restructured the basic foundation of a family and a kingdom? Finally, Alexander stood, signaling that the formal portion of the evening was over. "We will not discuss this matter with anyone outside this room until the official communications are prepared. Is that understood?" The others nodded, but the weight of keeping such a massive secret pressed down on all of them like a physical burden. Victoria spent the next 3 days in what could only be described as strategic retreat. She canceled all public appearances, citing a minor illness, and used the time to carefully consider her position. The former queen understood that her next moves would determine not only her own future, but potentially the stability of the kingdom itself. On the 4th morning after the devastating family meeting, Victoria requested a private audience with Lord Harrison. The spymaster was surprised by the formal invitation, delivered by Victoria's lady-in-waiting with all the ceremony typically reserved for royal correspondence. Despite her stripped title, Victoria was conducting herself with the same dignity and authority she had always possessed. Harrison found Victoria in her private study, a room she had designed to serve as a retreat from the more formal spaces of the palace. Books lined the walls, and comfortable chairs were arranged near large windows that provided natural light for reading. But today the atmosphere was anything but relaxed. Victoria had clearly prepared for this meeting with the same care she had once brought to diplomatic negotiations. Papers were arranged neatly on her desk, and she was dressed in a deep green gown that conveyed both authority and accessibility. Her golden hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and her gray eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Lord Harrison, thank you for agreeing to see me," Victoria began. gesturing for him to take a seat across from her desk. "I believe we have matters to discuss that could benefit both our positions." Harrison settled into the offered chair, his expression carefully neutral. Your Grace, I am at your service, though I must confess uncertainty about what matters you wish to discuss." Victoria noted his hesitation over her new title, but chose not to address it directly. "I want to discuss Duke Magnus and the broader implications of his activities. I believe there are aspects of this situation that may not have been fully explored." The spymaster leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "I'm listening." Victoria opened a leather folder and removed several sheets of paper covered with her neat handwriting. "I have been reviewing my correspondence with Magnus from memory, trying to recall details that seemed insignificant at the time but might be important now. I believe he was not simply collecting information from me. He was conducting a much more sophisticated intelligence operation." She handed Harrison the first sheet of paper. "These are the topics Magnus specifically asked about in his letters, organized chronologically. You'll notice that his inquiries became increasingly specific over time, and they correlate precisely with major policy decisions that were being debated in private council meetings." Harrison studied the document carefully, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the pattern Victoria had identified. "This suggests he had advanced knowledge of our internal debates. He knew which questions to ask to elicit the most useful responses." "Exactly," Victoria replied, "which means he had another source of information within the palace, someone who could tell him what topics were being discussed and when I would be most likely to have relevant details to share innocently." The implications of Victoria's analysis were staggering. If she was correct, then she had been manipulated as part of a larger espionage operation. Rather than being a willing or careless collaborator, she had been a carefully targeted victim. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the timeline Victoria had constructed. His analytical mind was already considering the possibilities and their ramifications. "If you're correct, then we need to identify who else had access to council meeting agendas and topics. The list of people with that information is relatively short." Victoria handed him a second document. "I've prepared a preliminary analysis. These are the people who would have had advanced knowledge of council discussions, organized by their level of access and opportunity to communicate with external contacts." The list included several surprising names: senior advisors, department heads, and even some palace staff who handled confidential correspondence. But what made Victoria's analysis particularly valuable was her insider knowledge of palace dynamics and personal relationships. "Lord Pemberton has gambling debts," Victoria noted, pointing to one name on the list. "He's been discreet about it, but I've noticed signs of financial stress. Duke Magnus is known to be wealthy and generous with those who assist him." Harrison made notes beside several names, his respect for Victoria's analytical abilities growing with each revelation. "This level of insight is invaluable. You've identified vulnerabilities and connections that our regular intelligence gathering might have missed." Victoria leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a small smile. "Lord Harrison, I may no longer hold the title of Queen, but I haven't lost my intelligence or my love for this kingdom. If there is indeed a spy within our walls, I want to help identify them." The spymaster was beginning to see Victoria in an entirely new light. Rather than the naive woman who had been manipulated into compromising correspondence, he was confronting someone with sharp analytical skills and a deep understanding of palace politics. "What do you propose?" Harrison asked. Victoria's expression became more serious. "I want to help you conduct a proper investigation. But I want something in return, not restoration of my title. That ship has sailed. I want the truth to be known. If I was manipulated rather than treacherous, I want that fact to be part of the official record." Harrison considered her proposal carefully. Victoria's insider knowledge and motivation to clear her name could indeed be valuable assets in uncovering the broader conspiracy. But involving her in an active investigation would be unprecedented and potentially dangerous. The king would need to approve any such arrangement, Harrison said carefully, and there would be significant restrictions on your involvement for security reasons. I understand, Victoria replied. But consider the advantages. I have relationships and insights that your regular agents cannot duplicate. I can observe palace dynamics in ways that others cannot, and I have a very personal motivation to see this investigation succeed. Before Harrison could respond, Victoria handed him a third document. "I've also prepared this, a letter to Duke Magnus that goes beyond simply ending our correspondence. It's designed to elicit responses that might reveal the scope of his operation and potentially identify his other sources." Harrison read the letter twice, impressed despite himself. Victoria had crafted a message that appeared to be a wounded friend seeking understanding, while actually being a sophisticated intelligence trap. The letter would likely prompt Magnus to reveal information about his methods and possibly his other contacts. "This is quite skillfully done," Harrison admitted, "but sending such a letter would essentially make you an active agent in this investigation. The risks would be considerable." Victoria's eyes flashed with something that might have been excitement. "Lord Harrison, for nearly 3 decades I've attended state dinners and cut ribbons at charity events. I've been decorative and diplomatic and proper. But I've also been observing, learning, and thinking. Perhaps it's time to put those skills to more active use." The transformation in Victoria was remarkable. The devastated woman who had sat frozen in the blue drawing room just days earlier had been replaced by someone who was clearly energized by the challenge of proving her innocence and protecting her. Kingdom Harrison found himself in an unprecedented situation. The former queen was essentially offering to become an intelligence asset, and her proposal had genuine merit. But the political and personal complexities were staggering. "I will need to discuss this with the king," Harrison said finally, "but I will present your analysis and proposals seriously. Your insights have already advanced our understanding of this situation significantly." Victoria nodded, having expected that response. "I understand the king's position is difficult, but Lord Harrison, if there is indeed a spy in the palace who used me to cover their own activities, then my disgrace serves their purposes perfectly. Everyone will be watching me while they continue their real work undetected." As Harrison prepared to leave, Victoria handed him one final document. "These are my thoughts on how to structure the investigation to avoid alerting any potential spies to our suspicions. I believe we can gather the information we need while maintaining the fiction that I'm simply a disgraced former queen, quietly accepting her punishment." Harrison tucked all of Victoria's documents into his portfolio, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Your Grace, regardless of what the king decides about your direct involvement, your analysis has been extremely valuable. I will ensure that your insights are properly considered." After Harrison left, Victoria remained in her study, staring out at the palace gardens that would soon no longer be hers to enjoy freely. But for the first time since that terrible night in the blue drawing room, she felt something other than despair. She felt purpose. If Alexander wanted to strip away her title and position, she would accept that punishment with dignity, but she would not accept being remembered as a fool who betrayed her kingdom through carelessness. The truth was more complex, and she intended to prove it. Victoria began planning her next moves with the same careful attention to detail that had made her an effective queen. She would clear her name, protect her kingdom, and perhaps discover abilities she had never been allowed to fully explore. The game was just beginning. King Alexander sat in his private study the following morning. Lord Harrison's report spread across his desk like pieces of a complex puzzle. The spymaster's account of his meeting with Victoria had forced the king to reconsider everything he thought he understood about the situation that had torn his family apart. "You're certain of her analysis?" Alexander asked, looking up from the documents Victoria had prepared. The neat handwriting that had once adorned love letters and personal notes to him now outlined what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence operation. Harrison nodded gravely. "Your Majesty, her insights reveal patterns that our initial investigation missed. The timeline she constructed shows clearly that Duke Magnus was receiving guidance about which topics to pursue. Someone was directing his inquiries." Alexander walked to his window, the same window where he had made his devastating decision days earlier. The kingdom stretched out before him, peaceful and prosperous, unaware of the conspiracy that threatened its security from within. "If Victoria was being manipulated rather than acting deliberately, then I have committed a grave injustice," Alexander said quietly. The admission cost him dearly. Kings were not supposed to make such fundamental errors in judgment. "The evidence suggests a more complex situation than we initially understood," Harrison replied diplomatically. "But there is still the matter of her indiscretion in sharing sensitive information, regardless of her intentions." Alexander turned back to face his spy master. "What do you recommend regarding her proposal to assist with the investigation?" Harrison had been preparing for this question since leaving Victoria's study. "Sir, her access to palace social dynamics and her motivation to uncover the truth make her potentially valuable. But involving her directly would be unprecedented and carries significant risks." "What kind of risks?" "If she is still unknowingly compromised, her involvement could alert the real spy to our investigation. If she seeks revenge for her lost title, she might manipulate the investigation for personal gain. And if word of her involvement becomes public, it could create the impression that you're unable to manage either your kingdom or your family." Alexander considered these concerns while reviewing Victoria's proposed letter to Duke Magnus. Despite his personal feelings, he had to admit that the message was masterfully crafted, appearing innocent while designed to extract valuable intelligence. "There is another consideration," Harrison continued carefully. "Prince Edward has been asking pointed questions about the investigation. He's not satisfied with our explanations, and he has considerable influence within the military. Princess Catherine has been equally vocal in private about her mother's treatment." The king's jaw tightened. He had hoped that his children would accept his decision based on trust in his judgment, but their continued questions threatened to create a rift that could damage the monarchy's stability. "Are you suggesting that my own children might interfere with matters of national security?" "I'm suggesting that they love their mother and believe she has been treated unjustly. If they discover evidence that supports that view, they might take actions that complicate our situation further." Alexander realized that Harrison was diplomatically warning him about the possibility of a palace revolt led by his own heir. The political implications were staggering. Edward had the loyalty of the military, while Catherine had strong connections with the nobility through her marriage. Meanwhile, in the east wing of the palace, Prince Edward was conducting his own investigation. He had spent the morning reviewing security protocols and interviewing palace staff about recent changes in routine or behavior. His military training had taught him to gather intelligence methodically, and he was applying those skills to protect his mother. Edward's aide, Captain Morrison, had been discreetly questioning guards and servants about unusual activities or visitors in the weeks leading up to the crisis. The young captain's loyalty to the prince made him an ideal investigator for sensitive matters. "Your Highness," Morrison reported, "there have been several interesting developments. Lord Pemberton has been seen in the palace at unusual hours, often in areas where he has no official business. Additionally, 3 separate staff members have mentioned receiving questions about the Queen's daily schedule from someone claiming to be updating security protocols." Edward's eyes sharpened. "Who was asking these questions?" "That's where it becomes interesting, sir. The descriptions don't match any current security personnel. Someone has been gathering intelligence about Mother's movements and routines." This information confirmed Edward's growing suspicion that his mother had been targeted rather than simply careless. He decided to take a more direct approach to uncovering the truth. Edward requested a meeting with Lord Harrison, but he did not go alone. Princess Catherine accompanied him, presenting a united front that the spymaster could not easily dismiss. They met in Catherine's private sitting room, away from the more formal areas of the palace where conversations might be overheard. "Lord Harrison," Edward began without preamble, "we want the complete truth about the evidence against our mother, not the sanitized version presented to protect our feelings, but the actual intelligence and how it was obtained." Harrison found himself in an impossible position. The royal children were within their rights to ask such questions, but revealing operational details could compromise ongoing investigations. Catherine leaned forward, her expression intense. "We know there's more to this situation than Father has shared. Mother may have been indiscreet, but the idea that she deliberately betrayed the kingdom is absurd. We want to know who really benefits from her disgrace." The princess's words struck uncomfortably close to theories that Harrison himself had begun developing. Victoria's removal from influence cleared the way for other power brokers to increase their access to the king, and several palace figures had indeed seemed unusually eager to distance themselves from the fallen queen. "Your Highnesses, I understand your concerns, but I cannot discuss operational details of an ongoing investigation," Harrison replied carefully. Edward's expression hardened. "Then we'll conduct our own investigation. I have resources and authority that don't require your cooperation." The threat was clear, Edward would use his military connections and position as heir to gather information independently. Such parallel investigations could interfere with each other and potentially alert any real conspirators to the increased scrutiny. Harrison made a calculated decision. If I were to hypothetically discuss certain aspects of this situation, it would be with the understanding that any information shared remains completely confidential. Catherine nodded immediately. Of course. Your mother has provided analysis that suggests she was manipulated as part of a larger operation. The evidence indicates that someone with access to private counsel information was directing Duke Magnus's inquiries to maximize the intelligence value of his correspondence with the Queen. Edward and Catherine exchanged glances. Their suspicions confirmed. So Mother was a victim, not a perpetrator, Catherine said. The situation appears more complex than initially assessed, Harrison admitted. But your father's decision was based on the evidence available at the time, and changing it now would require proof of deliberate manipulation rather than simply poor judgment. Edward stood and began pacing, his mind working through the implications. Who had access to council meeting agendas? Who could have known which topics would be most valuable to foreign intelligence? Harrison realized that the prince was asking the same questions that Victoria had raised, approaching the problem with similar analytical rigor. The royal family's intelligence clearly ran deeper than their public roles suggested. We are pursuing those lines of inquiry, Harrison said carefully. We want to help, Catherine stated firmly, not as concerned family members but as people with unique access to palace dynamics and social relationships. We see things that your regular agents might miss. The offer was remarkably similar to the one Victoria had made, and Harrison realized that the entire royal family was thinking strategically about this crisis, rather than simply reacting emotionally. Before Harrison could respond, Edward's aide appeared in the doorway with an urgent expression. Your Highness, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development. Lord Pemberton has requested an immediate private audience with the king. He claims to have urgent information about Duke Magnus. The timing was suspicious, coming just as investigations were intensifying. Harrison's expression became grim as he considered the possibilities. Either Pemberton had legitimate new intelligence, or he was attempting to control the narrative before evidence of his own involvement could be discovered. I need to attend that meeting, Harrison said, rising quickly. Edward caught his arm. We're coming with you. If Pemberton is involved in this conspiracy, he might try to manipulate Father further. You'll need witnesses who understand the broader context. Harrison wanted to refuse, but he realized that Edward and Catherine might indeed provide valuable perspective on whatever Pemberton was planning to reveal. The investigation was about to enter a new and potentially dangerous phase. As they hurried toward the king's study, none of them noticed the figure watching from a shadowed alcove, noting their urgent conference with great interest. The palace had many eyes and ears, and not all of them served the crown faithfully. The game of palace intrigue was becoming more complex by the hour, with multiple players pursuing their own agendas while the truth remained carefully hidden beneath layers of deception and manipulation. But Victoria's analysis had set events in motion that would soon force all the conspirators into the open, whether they were ready or not. Lord Pemberton stood before King Alexander's desk, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air flowing through the palace windows. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a leather portfolio against his chest like a shield. Your Majesty, Pemberton began, his voice strained. I come before you with information that cannot wait. Information about Duke Magnus and his operations within our kingdom. Alexander studied his longtime advisor carefully. Pemberton had served the crown faithfully for 15 years, managing diplomatic correspondence and trade negotiations with skill and discretion. But something in his manner today suggested desperation rather than loyal duty. Lord Harrison stood near the window, having arrived moments before Pemberton's dramatic entrance. Prince Edward and Princess Catherine had positioned themselves near the door, their presence clearly making Pemberton nervous. Continue, Alexander said simply, his voice betraying none of the suspicion that Victoria's analysis had planted in his mind. Pemberton's eyes darted around the room, lingering on Edward and Catherine with obvious discomfort. Your Majesty, perhaps this matter would be better discussed in private? The information I carry involves sensitive details about foreign intelligence operations. My children have my complete trust, Alexander replied firmly, as does Lord Harrison. Speak freely. Pemberton's jaw tightened, but he had no choice but to proceed. Your Majesty, I have discovered that Duke Magnus has been operating an extensive spy network within our palace. The scope of his operation goes far beyond the correspondence with the former queen. The calculated pause before mentioning Victoria was not lost on anyone in the room. Pemberton was being careful to distance himself from any suggestion of sympathy for the fallen queen. What evidence do you have of this network? Harrison asked, stepping forward with professional interest. Pemberton opened his portfolio and removed several documents with shaking hands. I have been conducting my own investigation since the scandal broke. Magnus has been recruiting palace staff, offering payments for information about policy discussions, military movements, and royal family activities. Edward moved closer to examine the documents, his expression skeptical. When did you first become aware of these recruitment attempts? Just recently, Your Highness, Pemberton replied quickly. I began noticing unusual patterns in staff behavior and started investigating privately. Catherine's eyes narrowed. If Magnus has been recruiting palace staff for months or years, why are you only discovering this now? Surely someone in your position would have noticed such activities earlier. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Pemberton's story was beginning to sound less like the testimony of a loyal investigator and more like the desperate fabrication of someone trying to deflect suspicion. Harrison studied the documents Pemberton had provided, his experienced eye immediately noting several inconsistencies. The papers were too neat, too complete, as if they had been prepared specifically for this moment rather than discovered through genuine investigation. Lord Pemberton, Harrison said carefully, these documents suggest that Magnus's operation has been active for over a year. During that time, you attended numerous council meetings where sensitive information was discussed. Did you never suspect that this information was being compromised? Pemberton's face grew pale. There were some discussions that seemed to go poorly, negotiations that failed unexpectedly, but I attributed those outcomes to normal diplomatic challenges. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying Pemberton with the calculating gaze that had served him well in 3 decades of rule. Tell me, Pemberton, how exactly did you uncover this network if it was so well hidden that our professional intelligence services failed to detect it? The question was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. If Pemberton claimed to have superior investigative skills than Lord Harrison's agents, he would be insulting the kingdom's intelligence apparatus. If he admitted to having inside knowledge, he would be confessing his own involvement. Pemberton's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I received information from a source who wished to remain anonymous. Someone who felt guilty about their involvement and wanted to make amends. Edward stepped forward, his military bearing making him seem larger and more intimidating than usual. What was your personal relationship with Duke Magnus, Lord Pemberton? Had you ever met him before this crisis began? Yes, we had met at diplomatic functions. Standard protocol for someone in my position. How many times? Catherine pressed. When was your most recent meeting? Pemberton was trapped by the rapid-fire questions, his story becoming more fragmented with each response. I don't recall the exact number. Perhaps 3 or 4 times over the years. Harrison had been quietly reviewing financial records on his own device while Pemberton spoke. Now he looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. Lord Pemberton, our treasury records show that you received substantial payments from foreign accounts over the past 8 months. Payments that correspond precisely with major policy discussions and council meetings. Would you care to explain these transactions? The room fell silent except for Pemberton's labored breathing. His carefully constructed story was collapsing under the weight of evidence and pointed questions. Alexander rose from his chair, his voice carrying the full authority of the crown. Lord Pemberton, you are under arrest for treason against the Kingdom of Valdoria. You will be held pending a full investigation into your activities and associations. But Pemberton was not finished. In his desperation, he made a choice that would change everything. You cannot arrest me without destroying yourselves, he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. I have detailed records of every piece of information I provided to Magnus. Records that show exactly how I obtained that information and from whom. Harrison moved swiftly to position himself between Pemberton and the door, But the traitor was beyond caring about escape routes. The Queen was not my only source, Pemberton continued, his voice rising to near hysteria. Others provided information willingly or unwittingly. If you prosecute me, I will expose everyone who contributed to Magnus's intelligence operation, regardless of their intentions or knowledge. Edward and Catherine exchanged alarmed glances. Pemberton was threatening to bring down multiple members of the palace hierarchy in a desperate attempt to save himself. You will expose yourself as a traitor, and nothing more, Alexander said coldly. Your threats carry no weight, Pemberton laughed bitterly. Don't they? What happens when the people learn that their beloved queen was stripped of her title based on incomplete evidence? What happens when they discover that the real spy continued operating freely, while an innocent woman was punished for his crimes? The political implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If Pemberton's full story became public, it would not only exonerate Victoria but also expose the king's hasty judgment and the palace's security failures. The monarchy itself could be destabilized by the revelation. But Pemberton had underestimated the royal family's resolve. Catherine stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. Lord Pemberton, you seem to believe that the truth will harm us more than it will harm you. You're wrong. Our family made a mistake based on false evidence that you helped provide. We will acknowledge that mistake and take responsibility for correcting it. You, however, will face the full consequences of treason. Edward nodded in agreement with his sister. The people of Valdoria value truth and justice above royal pride. If we have wronged our mother, we will make it right publicly and completely. Alexander looked at his children with a mixture of pride and pain. Their willingness to sacrifice royal dignity for justice reminded him of why he had fallen in love with Victoria decades earlier. They had inherited not only their mother's intelligence but also her moral courage. Lord Harrison, Alexander said formally, please escort Lord Pemberton to secure quarters while we prepare formal charges, and please send word to the Duchess of Rosemount that I require her immediate presence. As Harrison led Pemberton away, the former advisor made one final desperate statement. Magnus knows about this meeting. He'll be expecting our communications to be compromised now. You've lost any advantage you might have had. The warning sent a chill through the room. If Pemberton was correct, then Duke Magnus would already be taking steps to protect himself and his remaining assets. The window for gathering additional evidence might be closing rapidly. Edward turned to his father. We need to move quickly. If Magnus is indeed preparing to disappear or destroy evidence, we have very little time to salvage this investigation. Catherine was already moving toward the door. I'll find Mother and bring her here immediately. Telly. She needs to know that her analysis was correct and that her name is being cleared. As the princess hurried from the room, Alexander remained standing behind his desk, staring out at the kingdom he had sworn to protect. In trying to serve that oath by removing what he believed was a security threat, he had instead protected the real enemy while destroying the woman he loved. The irony was bitter, but the immediate priority was clear. The royal family needed to unite to address the crisis that Pemberton's exposure had created. And that meant admitting mistakes, seeking forgiveness, and rebuilding trust that had been shattered by incomplete truths and hasty judgments. Victoria was about to learn that her disgrace was ending, but the real battle for the kingdom's security was just beginning. Victoria entered the king's study with the measured pace of someone who had learned to expect both the best and worst from fate in rapid succession. She wore a simple gray dress that seemed to reflect her uncertain status. No longer a queen, not quite a private citizen, but something undefined in between. Alexander stood as she entered, a gesture of respect that had been absent from their recent interactions. The formal distance between them felt like an ocean, but there was something different in his expression today. The cold authority had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like regret. Victoria, he began, using her name without title for the second time in their long relationship. Please sit down. We have much to discuss. Prince Edward and Princess Catherine were already present, their expressions mixing relief with apprehension. Lord Harrison stood near the window, holding documents that would soon reshape everything the family thought they knew about the past week's events. Victoria took her seat with characteristic dignity, her hands folded in her lap. I assume this concerns Lord Pemberton's arrest? The palace staff are buzzing with rumors. Alexander's jaw tightened. Even in disgrace, Victoria's intelligence network among the servants remained intact. She had always possessed an uncanny ability to understand palace dynamics from multiple perspectives. Lord Pemberton has confessed to providing information to Duke Magnus in exchange for substantial financial payments, Alexander said directly. Your correspondence with Magnus was manipulated as part of a broader espionage operation designed to use you as an unwitting source while protecting the real spy. The words hung in the air as Victoria processed their full meaning. Her analysis had been correct. She had been a victim rather than a perpetrator. But the vindication came wrapped in the bitter knowledge of how much damage had been done by incomplete investigation. I see, Victoria said quietly. And what does this mean for my current situation? Catherine leaned forward, her voice emotional but steady. It means you were wronged, Mother. Terribly wronged. And we need to find a way to make this right. Edward nodded in agreement. The evidence clearly shows that you were manipulated rather than careless. Your title was removed based on false assumptions about your actions and intentions. Victoria looked at Alexander, studying his face for clues about his thoughts. And what does the king believe should be done about this revelation? Alexander had been dreading this moment since Harrison had presented the evidence of Pemberton's guilt. Admitting error was always difficult for a monarch, but admitting error that had caused such personal and political damage was excruciating. I was wrong, Alexander said simply. I acted on incomplete information and allowed my fear for the kingdom's security to override careful judgment. You deserve not only an apology, but restoration of everything that was taken from you. The admission hit Victoria like a physical blow. For days she had fantasized about hearing those words, but now that they were spoken, she felt only exhaustion. Too much had been broken to be easily repaired. Alexander, she said softly, an apology cannot undo the humiliation or erase the damage done to the monarchy's reputation. Restoring my title now will raise questions about your judgment that could destabilize the very security you were trying to protect. Lord Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Grace, there are indeed significant political considerations to address. Lord Pemberton's threats about exposing the full scope of the intelligence operation were not entirely empty. A public revelation of the mistakes made could damage confidence in the crown. Victoria's eyes sharpened with interest. What exactly did Pemberton threaten to reveal? That you were innocent, that the investigation was flawed, and that the real spy continued operating while you were punished for his crimes, Edward replied. He believes that exposing the truth will protect him somehow. A small smile crossed Victoria's lips. Pemberton always was more clever with manipulation than with long-term strategy. He's handed us exactly what we need to resolve this crisis properly. The others looked at her with curiosity and growing admiration. Even in the midst of personal vindication, Victoria was thinking strategically about the kingdom's welfare. Explain, Alexander requested. Victoria stood and moved to the window, looking out at the palace gardens that had been her refuge for so many years. We announce the truth ourselves completely and immediately. We reveal Pemberton's treason, acknowledge the mistakes in the investigation, and restore my title with full explanation of why it was necessary. Catherine frowned. But won't that damage Father's reputation and the monarchy's credibility? Not if we handle it correctly, Victoria replied, turning back to face the room. The people of Valdoria value honesty and justice. They will respect a king who admits error and corrects it rather than one who covers up mistakes to protect his pride. Edward was already seeing the political logic. Mother's right. If we control the narrative by telling the complete truth immediately, we demonstrate strength rather than weakness. We show that the monarchy serves justice rather than self-interest. Alexander considered this approach carefully. It went against every instinct that had been trained into him about protecting royal dignity and maintaining the mystique of infallible authority. But he was beginning to understand that those old models of monarchy might not serve Valdoria well in changing times. What specifically do you propose? He asked. Victoria's expression became more animated as she outlined her strategy. We hold a public ceremony in 3 days. You announce the discovery of Pemberton's treason, acknowledge that the evidence against me was deliberately falsified, and restore my title with full honors. We invite the diplomatic corps, the press, and representatives from all major cities. Harrison looked troubled. Such a public admission could invite foreign powers to question our intelligence capabilities and internal security. Or it could demonstrate that our security is strong enough to detect and correct infiltration, Victoria countered. Duke Magnus's operation has been exposed and dismantled. We've proven that attempts to manipulate our royal family will ultimately fail. Alexander walked to his desk and sat down heavily. The weight of decision was familiar, but this choice felt more personal and consequential than most he had faced as king. There's another consideration, he said slowly. Our marriage. This crisis has exposed problems that go beyond espionage and security. We've grown apart over the years, and this situation has revealed how little we've truly communicated about important matters. Victoria's expression softened. Alexander, restoring my title is about justice and the kingdom's welfare. Rebuilding our marriage is a separate issue that will require time and honest conversation. Catherine looked between her parents with hope and concern. Can't both things happen? Can't we heal the family while also serving the kingdom? Edward placed a supportive hand on his sister's shoulder. They're both adults who have loved each other for decades. If they decide to work on their relationship, they'll find a way. If they decide they function better as partners in service rather than as romantic partners, that's their choice to make. The mature perspective from their children surprised both Alexander and Victoria. Their son and daughter had clearly given serious thought to the complexities of royal marriages and the balance between personal happiness and public duty. Alexander looked directly at Victoria. What do you want? Not what's best for the kingdom or our children or public perception. What do you want for yourself? Victoria considered the question carefully. I want to serve Valdoria in whatever capacity allows me to be most useful. I want our children to be proud of how we handle this crisis, and I want to discover who I am beyond the roles I've played for 3 decades. The honesty in her response was striking. Victoria was not simply seeking restoration of her previous position. She was looking toward a future that might be different from anything she had previously imagined. Then we move forward together, Alexander decided. We announce the truth in 3 days, restore your title, and allow the kingdom to judge our honesty rather than fear their judgment of our mistakes. Lord Harrison began making notes about the arrangements required for such a significant public announcement. The ceremony would need to balance royal dignity with accessibility, demonstrating both strength and humility. Victoria returned to her chair, but her posture was different now. The defeated woman who had entered the room had been replaced by someone who looked ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. There's one more thing, she said. I want to continue the intelligence work I began during this investigation. I've discovered abilities and interests that I never had the opportunity to explore as queen. Perhaps there's a role for me in palace security that serves both personal fulfillment and national interests. Alexander's eyebrows rose in surprise, but Edward and Catherine exchanged knowing glances. They had seen their mother's analytical capabilities during the crisis, and weren't surprised by her interest in using those skills more actively. We'll discuss that possibility after we address the immediate crisis, Alexander said. But your insights during this investigation have been invaluable. As the family began planning for the public ceremony that would restore Victoria's title and reveal the truth about Pemberton's betrayal, there was a sense of new beginning rather than simple restoration. The crisis had changed all of them, revealing strengths they hadn't known they possessed and clarifying values that would guide their future decisions. The kingdom of Valdoria was about to witness something unprecedented. A royal family choosing complete honesty over protective deception, demonstrating that true strength comes from acknowledging mistakes and correcting them, rather than hiding them. In 3 days, Queen Victoria would stand before her people once again, vindicated and restored. But more importantly, she would stand as someone who had discovered new aspects of herself through adversity, and was ready to serve her kingdom in ways that honored both tradition and progress. The crown's greatest crisis had become its greatest opportunity for renewal.